Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you.
Hello and welcome to Spybrary episode 244. And do we have a treat for you today? Now, I am very lucky. When I travel the world, very often I'm able to grab a drink or lunch or have dinner even with some of our favorite spy authors. And I often think to myself, I wish I'd brought a bug. I wish I had some kind of listening device. I should have called Roddy Ho and got him to give me something to record these conversations, because it is really exciting. It's enthralling. Just to hear authors talk about their craft, their trade, their challenges, their travels, their research. And I think, I wish I could bring this to all the Spybarians. Got the next best thing for you today. I invited onto the show Joseph Kanon. Now, many of you know Joseph, written epic books such as one of my favorites, Defectors, and he's number 3 in Tim Shipman's list. Now, Tim, if you don't know, ranked his top 125 spy authors. Not only does he rank them, but he also gives you where to start with each author and which one is his personal favorite. You can get that at the link in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening to this whilst evading your tail, you can get it at spybrary.com. Just go to the homepage, it's in the top right. You can get that list. Now, I thought the next best thing was, let's invite another prestigious spy author onto the show to have this conversation with Joseph. So we invited his friend and friend of the show, Paul Vidich. Paul Vidich, whose most recent book was Beirut Station. Highly recommend it, love it. I love all his work, to be honest, and the same for Joseph, and decided let's have a conversation between the two. So really excited to bring you this one. Now, if you enjoy it, if you're going to enjoy it, please drop us a like if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you drop into the comments more, please, I will do more. I will host and produce more of this style of interviews and conversations for you on Spybrary. So enough from me. I'm so excited to bring you this conversation with Joseph Kanon and Paul Vidich.
And you've named your books after those cities. And I'm curious, do you start with character? Do you start with place, setting? What sort of triggers your decision to place a book in a particular city?
I think almost invariably it starts with place. This was true of the first book I wrote, and it seemed to be the pattern that followed. It wasn't deliberate, but that's the way it happened. I think Shanghai is a perfect example of this. I was there as a tourist. I saw the things that anybody as a tourist would see, and it was, it's a fascinating city. Everyone says the same things. You get the soup dumplings, and you admire the infrastructure, and you walk along the Bund, and it's an exciting place to visit. But what's caught my attention was one of the minor tourist attractions is now some buildings have been preserved and restored in Hongqiu, which was a neighborhood which had been the former Jewish neighborhood just on the eve of World War II. And I hadn't known about this, and I thought, how curious. I wanted to know what it was like, and it's not a far walk from central Shanghai, so I walked it, and absolutely was fascinated once I finally got there. It seemed to me this extraordinary story that I and most people don't really know about. The synagogue that had served that community is now a museum. One of the streets used to be Little Vienna, and there had been pastry shops and German doctors, etc., etc. There had been an enclave of Central Europe right in the middle of old Shanghai, and I thought, how extraordinary. They have artifacts, they have photographs, all the things you might expect to find in a museum, and I was really taken with it. I wanted to know more. I thought, who knew? I never knew about this. There were some 20,000 of them there in 1939, and I thought, how did they get there? Why Shanghai? Why come to this place? So I started looking into it, and as usual, following that pattern that you mentioned with the books, the place comes first, and then it begins to fill up with people, and finally the plot emerges. In this particular case, I guess the people were the obvious ones. They were the ones who were going to arrive by boat during this window of opportunity. what had happened, if we can do a 1 minute history lesson and not bore our listeners entirely with it, is that after November 38 on Kristallnacht, it became very clear in Germany and most of Central Europe that this was not just going to be a discriminatory regime, the Nazis, it was going to be a murderous one. And if you wanted to save yourself, you had to get out. But this happened at a time when all the doors of the world were closing to Jewish refugees. There were no visas available anywhere. You could line up at the consulates only to have a door slammed in your face. There was simply no way out, except, as one of the rumors swept town, Berlin, Vienna, whichever town you're referring to in this case, that you could land in Shanghai. You didn't need an entry visa. You didn't need papers. All you had to do was get there. And to get there, you had to essentially abandon your life in Germany. You gave up your passport, all of your assets, all of your money, everything. But you saved your life. And some 20,000 of them, or roughly 18 to 20,000, it's an inaccurate count, did so. This opportunity only lasted for about a year because Kristallnacht was November 38, and by September 39, the war was on and the boats had stopped running, effectively settling the issue once and for all. But I thought, okay, but why was this the case? I mean, was it really just that Shanghailanders, as they called them, as the foreigners called themselves, were nice people and generous and open-hearted? And I thought, this really can't be it. There has to be some complicated reason for all of this. I mean, it was the only place in the world that was accepting Jewish refugees at this point. Even the Dominican Republic, which had been famously corrupt and used to sell visas, had stopped, I think literally out the side door of the consul, had to stop doing it. So this was it. This was your one chance.
So one of the things that really drew me into the novel from the very beginning is that the first sentence, where Daniel, one of your protagonists, is walking along the quay and he understands he's being followed. And so in a short sentence, you immediately bring some tension and suspense to the chapter. And then, of course, the chapter starts in Trieste and they're going to Shanghai. And it's in that chapter that you meet the other protagonist, Leah. And the two of their backstories emerge. And as one of the things about place that I've always found interesting is that people are in a place for a reason. And in that first chapter, you give us the reasons why they're going to Shanghai, which I thought was a brilliant sort of touch. You sort of bookend the novel with getting to Trieste, and the very end of the novel, you sort of imply a diaspora where they're leaving to some other place.
Right. I also wanted some indication of the variety of experience. I mean, not everyone who came on the Lloyd Triestino line arrived and had the same fate. You know, these were all individuals. Daniel, our protagonist, looks upon this as he got away with his life because he'd been active in the resistance movement, had not been caught, even though all of his friends had been. And for him to escape is literally to save his own skin. But he's also slightly exhilarated because he's now got the chance to start a new life, completely from scratch, so to speak. Leah, the woman that he meets, has a very different experience. I mean, her life has been turned upside down by the Nazis. She's responsible for a failing mother. She knows that her life is going to be transformed by this trip, but she's also cynical and pragmatic enough to know that it probably is going to be transformed for the worst, or at least the more difficult. And as she looks at all of the people on the boat, so happy to have escaped Europe, she thinks, but they don't know what they're getting into. And part of the point of this novel is that none of them really could know what they were getting into. It was an extraordinary place when they arrived. And what effect did it have on them? You know, it dealt different cards to different people, and I wanted that to be set up front. So naturally, the characters had to be very different. It was, you know, the place itself. Even now, it's quite. I think most people don't really understand how this all came about and why there would be the special dispensation from
So
Shanghai.
let me just interrupt here because one of the things that impressed me about the novel was the authenticity of the place. I felt like I was in a Shanghai from 1939, which of course um, wasn't the case, but it required sort of this sleight of hand on your part because you weren't in Shanghai in 1939 either, as far as I know. So I'm sort of curious how the research you did and the things that were required of you in order to create this illusion so effectively.
First of all, I should tell you that at one of the book events at a bookstore recently in the last month, someone did ask the question, was I in Shanghai during the war? Which I guess would make me about 120 or something, but I said, no, no, it's a research book. It's look, there are parts of Shanghai that do look as they would have looked in 1939. They were not necessarily leveled or destroyed, and they've been revived. What everyone now thinks of as the new Shanghai is a recent invention. It's only 10, 15 years that Pudong has been developed into this high-rise kind of fantasy city. So there are some bits of Shanghai that you can go to and see it as it once quite was, if not exactly was. This is particularly true in the French concession, where the French had held sway, and a lot of the pretty houses remain, and the plane trees, the avenues, etc., etc. Excuse me. But essentially, the Shanghai that you put on page is the Shanghai that's in your head, and you know, there's a limit to how accurate this can be. It has to be imaginatively accurate. It has to be the way you see it yourself. I would also admit that a lot of this, given the time period, a lot of this probably was influenced by movies of the period, not necessarily Shanghai Express or any of the sort of lurid books that are movies that depicted Shanghai as a kind of fabled city of vice, which it pretty much was, but not quite as fabled as they'd like to make it out. You absorb that kind of moodiness, you take the feel of it. I think the characters themselves begin to direct some things. I don't believe in magical thinking in writing. We're doing it, and you have to take responsibility for what's on the page. Whenever somebody says to me, the characters wrote it themselves, I thought, well, I don't think so. That's not the way that works. But I tend to do almost all the research through books and maps, photographs of the period. I mean, as it happens, it was very big on the international circuit, so there's been a lot of coverage of what it used to look like, and you can get a real sense of it.
When you did your research, did you rely on memoirs, actual accounts of people who lived there at that time?
Yes and no is the short answer to that. I would have preferred to do so, but there were a limited number of memoirs. I mean, the people we were interested in I was interested in they didn't have time to keep memoirs. They were, busy doing things. There have been recent books over the years which talk about the characters in the city of that period, and certainly I've read them, and some of them are more useful than others. When you are lucky enough to find a memoir, that's gold. Or something like letters or diaries or even journalism that's written at the time, because what you want is the sense of what assumptions are being made, how people feel about things or not. I mean, it's as revealing what a lot of these pieces don't say as what they do say. And it gives you a sense of the attitude of the Europeans who were living there, what they felt about the Chinese among them, their own sense of entitlement. I mean, all of these things which don't necessarily feature in the novel as a plot device or even something you have to discuss at any great length, but they should inform some of the attitudes of the characters. But anyway, the short answer, instead of the long-winded answer, is that mostly it's books. I love bibliography hunting when you're going down the page with your finger and you come across a title you've never heard of. about this subject and you thought you had been pretty well versed in it, so off you go to the library to take a look. I like that. I think that the hunt for the place and what it truly had been like is part of the attraction for me.
In a past conversation that you and I had, you told me, and I quote, "For me, dialogue is everything. Dialogue reveals character and it drives plot." Could you elaborate on that?
Well, it's personal bias. I think we all believe that what we happen to like ourselves is the way things should be. I love dialogue. I think that it's far and away the most useful of all the elements put into novel writing, prose writing. I think I also, maybe because of the influence of films, tend to see things in scenes and tend to see a kind of arc within the given scene. I once said to somebody once accused me of never describing my characters. And I said, well, actually, I think the minute they open their mouths, they describe themselves. And I truly believe that. I think that that dialogue is far and away the most revealing character device we have, and the one we should use more of. It's also fun to do, or at least it's fun for me. And I like it in other people's books. I think it has other uses as well. I mean, one of the things you don't want to be is didactic, and you want to get across the sense of period and the history, and there are certain facts that need to be put into the story so that the reader really understands them. I think this can most handily be done by dialogue, so that as they're talking to each other, the reader picks up on what the historical situation was that they're talking about, what attitudes were formed around it, etc. You can do it. I think we should trust the reader more. We don't have to teach in these books. All you have to do is let the characters speak, and we'll pick up on it, and even assume that we knew it.
You were when we were having that conversation, you were going on about how a particular writer, who will go unnamed, would talk about the aquiline nose and the gray hair and the pale eyes and on for a paragraph. And when you were done with the paragraph, you had no idea what this character looked like. But as soon as they open their mouth, it's like, oh, I know who that person is. And
yeah, don't you think? I mean,
I totally agree. It's a technique that I obviously have used in my own writing. I try to give enough of a character so that somebody has an idea. It's also partly the flow of a paragraph requires some introduction of a character, but it's really all through the dialogue that the character reveals him or herself. And I think that there are a lot of books that have been written in the past that are written today that to me feel bloated, or bloated may be the wrong term, but just bigger than they need to be. And you go through, and as I read them, I almost copy edit them, thinking they could have said all of this much with fewer words and more effectively.
I mean, it can be a technical challenge. I think one of the most admired scenes in vis-a-vis this sort of thing, using dialogue, is in Evelyn Waugh's Vile Bodies, where there's a conversation between the two lovers that never uses he said or she said. I mean, you can absolutely follow this page after page, who's speaking to whom, just by the dialogue and the tone of it.
I think
it's to do that. That's hard to do.
Right. But also, I think you don't use tags very much. When somebody speaks, they don't speak tenderly. they speak. And I think that's I think it's something that certainly Graham Greene adhered to. He hated, adverbs.
Right.
And Elmore Leonard had the same dislike for
famously
adverbs. Right. So I'm curious, what sort of do you have self-conscious rules about writing that you sort of have in the back of your mind as you're, going through one draft or another draft?
No, I mean, if you have a rule, it's only going to be broken, right? No, I mean, I would hope it's not too self-conscious the way it comes out. I just think this is the way people speak. When you're going back over it, you try to make it as tight as possible so that you're not wasting wasting the time. You know, the one huge advantage that film has over writing is you can see the faces, and you don't need, there are many scenes in movies that don't need dialogue. As they said famously in Sunset Boulevard, we didn't need it, we had faces. But I think that's true. And for us to work around that, those of us who work in prose fiction, to work around that failing of not having the face in front of us, we have to be able to do this through dialogue. I don't know that there's any other way that you can convey the emotions of a scene. I mean, a man and a woman are standing there in the rain under a umbrella, let's say, talking to each other, and what they say to each other has to do everything for the scene. You can't see them.
So you've raised the question of films, and there are references to movies in Shanghai, as there are in a number of your novels. In Shanghai, near the end, there's an interesting comparison of a bloody scene in which Leah has murdered a man, shot him in the head, the brain matter flying all around, and she says, well, in films, somebody shoots and somebody falls down. They don't show you the blood. And I found it fascinating that you have a character referencing, a way a movie would depict violence as the violence is happening on the page. It's sort of, to me, it suggested the influence or your affection for, movies of that era. And wonder if you could just sort of talk about that a little bit.
Certainly, it's that. I mean, I love movies, and I certainly love 40s movies and period movies, and I like noir, all of that. But it was also, the point here was also to say the same thing happens in novels. People fall down. I mean, unless you can really do the emotional impact of a death, violent, or however this person has met it, you're sort of trapped in that same cycle of pretend. This is what you want to suggest is that somebody being shot is a horrifying moment. It's really terrible. It's not just kiss, kiss, bang, bang. And it's not something that people recover from. Often there's another line that I use somewhere, and I can't remember now who I borrowed it from, but somebody had said, the thing about shooting is that the bullet never stops. It just keeps going. And as each person is affected by it, it's this chain reaction, sort of ricochet effect. I think that's true. And one of the things that you want to do in a scene like the one you just described is not simply that there has been a violent death, but that what they don't show you in movies, and sometimes don't show you in the books either, is how horrible it really is. It's a mess. It's not just a sound, not just a pop that you hear in the distance. I don't know if you've ever heard gunfire close up, but it's horrifying and I think very scary. That's rarely done or rarely said, and I think it's important to be said. And it was in this particular instance also an indication of what was going on inside her head and how completely flummoxed by this she was going to be.
This book is set in 1939. Most of your novel, I think the novel that is furthest along in time takes place in 1963. Most of your novels are around World War II. And you keep going back to that moment, that historical moment, and you mine it for some wonderful stories and characters. And I'm curious what it is that draws you back to World War II, just after that conflict.
I think it was the event of the last century, and certainly the hinge of it. It's inherently dramatic. Everything that happens takes on a weighted importance that may not have a similar resonance in contemporary life. We're often fond of saying this was a seminal moment, and because it happened to us and because it happens in our history, it is, I guess, from one point of view or another. But if you think about 1945, the immediate post-war period, which is the period I'm truly drawn back to over and over, It's you have perfectly ordinary people, just like you, me, I mean anybody you might see, who are taking decisions and doing things that are going to have ramifications for 50, 60 years to come. I think that um, the moment the test bomb goes off in Alamogordo, that the world changes. That there was before the atomic bomb and there's after it. This isn't just the invention of a better kind of hand grenade or superior weapon. This is the threat or the promise of self annihilation. That's a true game changer for the world. And I think anything having to do with it takes on a gravitas that it should. For us in the West, I think that I can't speak for the whole world, but I think for Western civilization, I think the Holocaust operated in a similar fashion morally. I mean, this was an event that's visited upon these highly evolved societies who had justified their taking over most of the rest of the world on the grounds that they were so much more civilized than anybody else. And that now there's this. And I think it's one of those moments when everybody stops, takes a deep breath, and says, "Let's look at that. We better really think this through. What's going on here? This is horrifying past any expectation." And it kind of gives the lie to who's morally superior.
How how uh, how does how would you think about your responsibility as a writer to sort of take on moral questions?
I think that all writing that's even vaguely serious, in one way or another, addresses this. Um, I'm not trying to make this sound portentous, much less make the book sound serious. I mean, I write what I hope are entertaining books, but I think within the entertainment, there is always this notion of how do we live? How should we live? I think these are the questions that underlie all prose exploration. If you're really trying to understand other people, I mean, who are the greatest mysteries of all are people. They're in their own whodunits, and it's up to us to discover who they really are and how we should interact with them. This is often subtle. Sometimes I think there are situations in Istanbul Passage. I have a scene where someone says, "What do you do when there's no right thing to do? Just the wrong thing," so that we're stuck with, well, what's the least harmful option I could take? Or you know, these are gradations, subtle gradations that I think are what we go through every day in life. And not to address them is not to get the point of writing.
Well, so Leah, who we meet in the first chapter, um, traveling with her mother, and they arrive in Shanghai, which is, by most accounts, or the Shanghai that you're depicting, pretty
Mhm.
corrupt. There's casinos, there's prostitution. It's a wild place, and she decides or chooses to basically sell herself as a way of surviving. And it was a very interesting choice to have her do that. But she is a heroine, and she sort of survives, and you have a lot of respect for her. But that's an example where you gave her a choice that she sort of takes advantage of and rises above. Um, and I'm just sort of curious how you chose to put her in that position and what you hoped she would sort of represent.
Right. Well, she didn't have a lot of choice. I mean, one of the things I wanted to convey, the lucky one here is Daniel, because he has an uncle already living in Shanghai who can get him a job and get him into the business. But for most of the others, the first thing they do when they arrive in Shanghai, utterly penniless, by the way, and without language, without passports, I mean, just bereft of everything, is that they're loaded by the local charities who are going to kind of transition them into some sort of self-independent living. They're loaded onto trucks and taken up to these dormitories called Haima, where at least it gets them off the street, and they're sort of rough and ready barracks and nobody's idea of a good time. But the charities have at least given them some shelter. Now they're just going to have to make their way. That's not as easy as we might imagine for anybody, and certainly not for a young woman in 1939. It's hard. And partly what I wanted to get across was the utter desperateness of most of these people. They had nothing, and some of them would live off charity and hand to mouth for the next few years. But for those who made a success of it, who made a go of it, and that was most of them. I mean, these people survived the war. They had truly saved themselves in all the meaningful ways. But for some people, it's much easier to give in to the temptation of what obvious choice is made for you. And that's Leah. She's also someone who's responsible for a mother who really can't cope with this, with the change of life that's represented by leaving Germany and coming to China. I mean, to her, it's like being on the moon. She just has no relationship to it at all. Anyway, partly what the book is meant to explore is what are desperate people capable of? What lines do you cross? What don't you cross? What do you consider bendable? We all know that if things were totally black and white, there would be this and there would be that, and there would be a pure choice between them. But in fact, life is gray, as everybody now admits. And it's composed of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so making these decisions, deciding how far you would go, would you kill somebody? What would be the circumstances in which that could be justified to yourself? Can it ever be justified? How deeply involved do you want to be in the politics if they become murderous? Is it ever justifiable from a political or ideological point of view to kill somebody? I think those are serious questions, and ones that are and inherently dramatic ones. And I think I'm curious to explore them, and I think readers are too. I think they're just versions of decisions that we have to make all the time.
This novel is not a spy novel. I would say it's sort of in an adjacent space. There are people in the background who are criminal activity, but you have written a number of wonderful spy novels, and I think when you've talked about them, you've sort of said a similar thing, which is that the world of spies is sort of a gray-toned world where nothing is all black and white, and people do things on behalf of some larger cause, even when those things might in some ways be despicable. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about, the spy novel and how it is an effective vehicle for you to take your characters and explore that world.
Sure. I think they're books I love to read myself. So partly it's just an affection for the genre, but even to define it as a genre is to limit it. I think that at the heart of successful spy fiction is a real interest in exploring character. Because the central fact about spies, but particularly the ones who are ideological spies and spies who are leading double lives, these are the really fascinating ones to me. I mean, somebody who's getting paid $10,000 to photograph a to provide a microfiche of something, it just doesn't interest me so much. What really interests me are people who are not whom they seem, who have in fact double lives. I think they are lying to everybody all the time. And therefore, it's a kind of perverse performance art that is utterly fascinating to observe from the outside once you know about it. I mean, is there anything more interesting in a way, really, than Philby and going through year after year of knowingly betraying all the people in your own office? Sometimes these characters, not just Kim, but sometimes their families don't know. Certainly children wouldn't know. Their wives often don't know. Their best colleagues. They are leading a complete fabrication all the time. And I thought, the tension that this sets up for the character gives it a kind of intensity and vitality that ordinary characters simply don't have. But it also addresses that fundamental question of who are we? And how do we know who other people are, etc. This is maybe a long-winded way of saying that I think it's about character. And if you really want to explore character, explore somebody who's pretending to be somebody else all the while. It's a fascinating double game that he's being played.
And one of the things that I find interesting about the spy novel is the way it grew up differently in the United States than it did in England. England had a long history of sending, its military and its spies into the world during the period of the empire. And the first novels that were spy novels, or thought to be spy novels, tended to be novels from England, whereas the United States didn't really have a spy novel until probably a good one, at least until the 60s, after World War II and after the United States had sort of laid itself out across the world. And I'm sort of curious if you just comment on the difference, in your view, the spy novel as it grew up in England versus the novel as it grew up in America.
Well, the British intelligence ministries have been there for decades and decades, and so you've got a lot of material to draw on. You also have potential writers, whereas the Americans didn't have. They had the individual service units had intelligence departments, the Army and the Navy, etc. But there was no centralized intelligence agency until the OSS was essentially replaced by CIA. That isn't an exact description of what happened, but it's the common way of sort of putting it across in one word, one sentence. I think that what I found interesting is that so many British spy novels were informed or were fascinated by this sense of betrayal. And I think a lot of this came from Philby and Burgess and MacLean, the Cambridge Five. I think that period that interests me as much as a lot of other people is about people who have turned on their own for all supposedly the right reasons. These are people who have taken an extreme step for what they believed at the time was the right way to go, only to discover this is not the case when they themselves are prisoners of the same system that they were supporting. That's a fascinating conundrum, and I think it has an endless fascination for the society. How can a society be betrayed from within? So it gnaws on them and becomes one of these leitmotifs that I think runs through a lot of British, but not all, but certainly a lot of British spy fiction. Whereas in America, I think one of the central events that informed it, spoke to a lot of writers, was the Kennedy assassination. I think that what you find in American spy fiction is a lot of conspiracy and a lot of outside forces that you can't understand. This is not like Guy Burgess sort of burrowing his way through a ministry and being at home in an office. These are about real spooks out there. I think there's just a slight difference in tone. Le Carré, who remains far and away the greatest of all the spy novelists, I think. But one of the innovations that he brought to the genre was simply to bring it into the office, to make us understand that this was bureaucratic as well as romantic and exotic. It wasn't Alan Ladd in a raincoat under a lamppost. It was somebody who was, trying to get the missing file, and why was it missing, and who signed out for it, and who didn't sign out for it, and all of that sort of bureaucratic claptrap that goes on. He really made that real and brought it home so that everybody could relate to it. They thought, well, we all have people like that in our office, and we all experience this, and impossible bosses and colleagues that just drive you nuts from time to time. All of that is in Le Carré, and you get it, I think, just spooned out to you. It's quite wonderful the way he does it. Graham Greene doesn't do that. And his books are not about the office. They're really the people out there under the lamppost. But he's so wonderful. What's the difference? I just think he's the writer. If one is ever compared to him, that's always a thrilling moment. He's a terrific writer.
So as long as we're on English writers, Len Deighton, who I only was introduced to by Tim Shipman, somehow I avoided reading his books earlier, but I found him a fascinating writer because he takes on English society in a different way than Greene or le Carré. His there's so much social activity in his novels. There's obviously a specific event or request that sort of drives the plot. But it's almost always that there's an uncle who's got a farm and he used to be in the service and his niece is there, who's a sister of the girlfriend. And you see this very complex social environment that he spends probably more time with than he does the actual, spy plotting. And I find that an interesting side to the English spy novel because it's something you don't see too much in the United States. I think you see it in Los Alamos. I think Los Alamos has that quality of, the community in which there is this mystery, but it's all about the relationships in this, confined community. And I don't think too many American novels in the genre do that or do it very effectively.
I think that's true. I mean, Americans like the loner figure, which is always popular. And the thing about Deighton that I find so interesting is that, and it is very much what you've just been saying, is that he's coming to it from the outside. He's really fascinated by it as a society. I mean, le Carré, I guess, could be described in some ways as an outsider, but he's basically an establishment. He's part of the privileged group that assumes this power or this position. Deighton is not. He's coming from the outside, and consequently, he's more interested in analyzing it and describing it and trying to figure it out and how people find their place in it one way or the other. And also, he's just a terrific writer. I mean, they're, wonderful set pieces. But I don't know. I mean, the more I make a broad generalization, the more I can think of examples that, are not the case. So I wouldn't say that Americans are all lone, conspiracy-driven nuts who are out there. But it is also true that you rarely get, until Charles McCarry and some of the people from the late 60s and early, and until you get people who actually have worked in the intelligence agencies and can talk about them as offices, as places where they live, then you examine this microcosm of society. But I think that's hard to do. I mean, I've never worked in any of this, even though every time you say you've never been in one, somebody at an event will say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So, you can't win.
I have one last question. So you've written eloquently about where writers write. Virginia Woolf had a room of her own. Edith Wharton was said to write in bed. And a few other writers treasure their privacy in the place where they can sort of find a place to live in their alternate world. And I'm curious, where do you write?
I write, and I've written every one of my books in the New York Public Library. And I love it. I mean, first of all, I was used to getting up and going to work, not just being at home. So I like that separation. Also, I used to walk there, and you'd be thinking about the book as you would do so you get into that fugue state that I think you need when you're actually writing. It also had all the books of the world available if you were doing research and wanted to find anything, so it was there. And it's a beautiful building, and I think it's terrific. Then the pandemic hit, and the library closed, and I realized that I had nowhere to work except the dining room table. So I wrote the Berlin Exchange at the dining room table. Then the pandemic, and the books that you see behind you, I mean, we're now in my little office at home. I've never had a home office, but since COVID, we decided we'd better convert one of these rooms so that I'd have someplace to work. But I haven't actually written a book here yet. I still go back to the library because it's not superstition, but you're used to whatever works for you, you keep it going. So it's there. Also, Bryant Park behind it is a wonderful place for lunch. You could get an apple and or even meet up with a friend and talk about spy fiction.
That's it, Shane. I think we're done.